Hi, everyone. It's great to have everyone joining us today. I'm Laura Brush, the Resilience Fellow here at C2ES, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Accelerating Local Climate Resilience, Building the Case for Strong Federal Support. We have a great event in store for you today on climate resilience. It's an area of climate policy that has seen, significant action in recent months and will need robust, sustained effort moving forward. And this discussion is timely as we've unfortunately continued to see the impacts of extreme weather events in recent months. Communities across the US are facing stronger hurricanes, longer and hotter heat waves, record-breaking drought, sea level rise, and severe wildfires that are only growing in intensity and frequency due to climate change. Improved climate resilience, however, can alleviate the growing impact of these events on public health and households and infrastructure. And here at C2ES, we believe that more action should be taken to increase the resilience of our communities, and that the federal government now has a strong opportunity to better support resilience building at the local level. So before we begin, I would like to cover a couple of logistical items. First, we will be recording the webinar. The recording will be available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. On our agenda, we're excited to first hear a keynote presentation from Crystal Lehman, who is Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. I'll then provide an overview of C2ES's federal resilience policy analysis and recommendations that are outlined in our new brief released today called A Federal Policy Action Plan to Accelerate Climate Resilience. After that, we'll hear from stakeholders who serve and engage with communities on climate resilience, followed by a moderated discussion with the panelists and an audience Q&A. For the Q&A, please submit your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and we'll try to answer them after the presentations. So for those not familiar with C2ES, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that brings together diverse interests to find solutions to our climate and energy challenges. We work with policymakers from the local to the federal levels and businesses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, deploy clean energy, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. On the last point, resilience has come to mean different things to different groups. We define climate resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances related to climate. Improving climate resilience involves assessing how climate change will create new or alter current climate-related risks and taking steps to better address those risks. Recent executive actions by the Biden administration and pending congressional actions represent significant steps forward on helping communities to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Continued action by all federal leaders will be needed to support communities in meeting the challenges ahead. And to hear more about that continued federal action, we are fortunate to be joined today by Crystal Lehman, who will give us an overview of the actions that the Biden-Harris administration is taking to improve resilience. Crystal specializes in climate, resilience, and energy policy. She currently serves as the Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Previously, Crystal managed a team at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, supporting disaster recovery and adaptation efforts. In addition, Crystal has served as a U.S. Department of Energy policy advisor, supporting community resilience and equity strategies and leading interagency coordination. So with that, I will turn it over to Crystal.
All right, well, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you so much for the organizers of this event. Very exciting. Afternoon, my name is Crystal Lehman. I am the Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and I'm really pleased to speak to you all today and outline the ongoing efforts the Biden administration is pushing forward, really to strengthen the U.S. to be more resilient against extreme weather events. The administration is working hard to lead efforts that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions nationwide. This includes a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, That is half the emissions by 2030. However, the administration also recognizes the ongoing climate change that we are experiencing today, and it's why the administration is interested in investing on resiliency efforts nationwide. As we all know, climate change is not a distant theoretical event. I don't have to convince those attending this event today that we are seeing impacts in real time. But here are some facts that people might not be as familiar with. Over the past few years, the US has seen the number of weather and climate disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion skyrocket. From the years 2000 to 2009, there's an average of 6 disasters a year, totaling $1 billion. Last year alone, the United States faced 22 such events with a cumulative price tag of nearly $100 billion. But there are solutions. According to the National Institute of Building Science, every dollar spent on pre-disaster mitigation by the federal government will save $6 in recovery costs. And these investments are important. So what have we been doing to address this? In the first week of office, the president issued Executive Order 14,008, which tasked the federal government with establishing a whole of government response to the climate crisis and increased resilience to the impacts of climate change. Climate change will impact every area of our country, economy, and government, which means that every agency must be a climate agency. A whole of government response ensures that the federal government presents a unified front on climate and considers climate resilience in every decision. The executive order also set up the National Climate Task Force. The task force is chaired by National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy and includes cabinet level leaders from 21 federal agencies. It aims to mobilize the Biden-Harris administration's implementation of a whole of government approach on climate change. In addition, the White House established 5 new interagency working groups to enhance climate resilience. This includes drought relief, flood resilience, coastal resilience, extreme heat, and wildfire. All 5 are working together to create the whole of government approach to tackling climate change issues and also facilitating partnerships between federal agencies. So I'll tick down what we've been doing so far with each of these working groups. First, the Coastal Resilience IWG, the Interagency Working Group. Many know that coastal regions are being affected by sea level rise, stronger and more frequent storms, increased flooding, and other climate-related impacts. The Coastal Resilience IWG has been working to coordinate efforts that better address the needs of local communities to implement coastal resilience efforts by aligning federal involvement in coastal resilience, including the importance of combining federal dollars and future climate data. Americans' coasts concentrate almost 40% of the population on only 10% of the country's land. Plus, many US coastal residents fall into an elevated coastal hazard risk category. And those residents, of course, include children, the elderly, and many others that occupy that space. We also have the Flood Resilience IWG. Through the Flood Resilience IWG, we are currently working to support federal agencies on the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, also known as FFRMS. President Biden's Executive Order 14,030 reinstituted FFRMS, the flood standard, a policy to improve the resilience of the nation's communities and federal assets against current and future flooding. A whole of government approach to implementing the flood standard requires easy access and accessible access, actually, usable forecasting data and tools. It's another task that the IWG will take on. In addition, many understand that wildfires have become a growing hazard in the United States with an increasing number of large blazes and prolonged seasons. Extreme heat and drought are challenging this event, and the Wildfire Resilience IWG is co-chaired by DOI, USDA, and OMB to identify opportunities to enhance wildfire resilience, connect science agencies to land management, and look at emergency management programs. The Extreme Heat Interagency Working Group recognizes that global temperature rise and extreme heat effects are being experienced with higher frequency and severity, in particular in low and moderate income communities. This Extreme Heat IWG is co-chaired by HHS, EPA, and NOAA. It's bringing together science agencies, environmental and health agencies, and response agencies to advance short and long-term strategies to reduce the impact of extreme heat on vulnerable communities. And finally, our Drought Relief Interagency Working Group. Drought is having severe impacts in the United States, particularly in the West. The Drought Relief Interagency Working Group is co-chaired by the USDA, Department of Interior, was established to facilitate interagency coordination on drought relief for affected communities and businesses. Many economic sectors, such as agriculture and ranching, are sensitive to regional changes in water availability. Water-dependent sectors depend on actionable climate information, and federal agencies are advancing the development and sharing of drought information. It's very important to recognize that the climate crisis affects people disproportionately. Environmental justice is an essential component to the White House's climate resilience work. Usually the most historically underserved and overburdened communities face the most challenge rebuilding and recovering from natural disasters. These communities bear a disproportionate burden from extreme weather events and climate change, and they often have challenge accessing resources too. We at the federal level have recognized and taken stock of our programs that serve disadvantaged communities. The administration's Justice 40 initiative will go a long way in that effort. Established by executive order, Justice 40 is making good on the president's promise to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. The White House issued interim guidance on Justice 40 initiative. The document provides implementation measures and includes accountability and transparency tools for agencies to use. The announcement also created a Justice 40 pilot program. That pilot program identifies 21 priority programs to immediately begin enhancing benefits for disadvantaged communities, programs that can provide a blueprint for other agencies in their own path to implementation of Justice 40. With environmental justice, engagement and consultation are also key, which is why the White House created the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, made up of 26 longtime environmental justice advocates and experts from across the country with experience working on these issues on the ground. So to sum it up, climate resilience solutions are attainable, feasible, and incredibly necessary. The IPCC report on climate change shows that some amount of climate change is already unavoidable. While we're working to reduce carbon emissions, we need to prepare for the climate impacts we're already seeing today. We need to invest in our communities because community resilience will be the backbone for some of their survival. As we head into COP26, we look forward to working with you and groups like this to further work in this space. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Crystal, so much for that overview. It's great to hear more about the work that the Biden administration is doing across hazards, especially ones that aren't as visible to, when we see a disaster like a flood, it's a lot more visible than perhaps extreme heat or drought can be. So I was wondering, you touched a bit on the equity considerations that the administration is making. Can you share a bit more about how the administration is integrating equity into its resilience action and what its plans are moving forward?
Absolutely. So what's interesting about Justice 40, it really is a very pioneering activity that the federal government's it's laying down the foundation to really look at environmental justice and the opportunities the federal government can move forward with. What I think is very interesting is that we're going to be combining different attributes of data and tools, which is going to be really important for us, especially looking at the climate risks the community will have. There will be a climate and environmental justice screening pool. Climate, it's a little bit of a long word. Climate and environmental justice screening tool that will be able to identify and help target communities most need of assistance. And that will also include resilience attributes as well. With the Justice 40 initiative, as I mentioned, there's going to be pilot programs throughout many different projects throughout the federal agencies, but then also really looking down to the ground level with our advisory council and what we can be doing on the resiliency space as well.
Great, thank you. And something we heard a lot about in our research, which I'll talk about next, is greater needs for climate risk data and technical assistance and capacity building. Can you talk a little bit more about the administration's priorities moving forward for better supporting communities and assessing their climate risks and developing plans for resilience?
Oh, absolutely. And that really is the heart of building resilience, is the planning component. It's really the planning principles too. It's having the understanding what the data is, having assistance in interpreting the data and then also implementing too. What we've been finding, which is great, through Executive Order 14,008, there's several agencies targeted to have development of a new product that will showcase all the different data tools as well as the resources that are available that really look at climate risks and incorporating that on the local level. The planning and data gaps we understand are quite large, and these 5 interagency working groups are really targeted to look at these pieces when it comes to wildfire, when it comes to drought, when it comes to extreme heat, because really the education as well as the implementation is where we'll need to be headed in order to make us more successful and also more resilient, of course.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, Crystal, again, for your time. And for
thank you. You all are, thank you so much. I really appreciate you for the invitation, and also I really appreciate you letting us speak and share the good work that we're doing. Stay tuned. We're excited about COP26. There'll be a lot going on. Looking forward to continued conversations.
Great. Thanks again. We really appreciate it. All right. So as we just heard from Crystal, the administration and federal agencies have taken and plan to take significant steps forward to strengthen resilience. C2ES is really excited by the administration's interest in this topic, as well as the active conversations in Congress on infrastructure and budget reconciliation that have the potential to significantly increase resources and support for resilience. Moving forward, sustained action on resilience will be critical to address local climate vulnerabilities in a robust way. C2ES hopes that our federal policy recommendations, which I'll discuss now, and that are outlined in our new brief, a federal policy action plan to accelerate climate resilience, can guide congressional, administrative, and agency level decision makers in current conversations and in the actions that they are planning to take moving forward. We think that more action is so badly needed because our cities and counties are first to feel the impacts of climate-related disasters. They have also often been the ones taking the lead in developing innovative solutions for resilience. But communities often do not have the resources and support to act on their own to implement resilience measures that can reduce their risks. At the same time, federal policies and programs have historically fallen short of supporting the level of action that is needed. So in our new policy brief, which you can see here, we outline federal strategies to improve community resilience and policy actions that we think the federal government should take to execute them. Our action plan shown here focuses on 4 strategies that we think could really transform the federal approach to resilience. These include working effectively and strategically to administer government resources, providing leadership to address gaps and drive the direction of resilience action, addressing inequities that put low-income and marginalized communities at higher risk, and acting as a strong partner to catalyze resilience action by local, tribal, state, and state governments, as well as the private sector. So to develop this action plan, we conducted a comprehensive literature review and interviewed representatives, which you can see on this slide, from all levels of government, nonprofit and academic leaders, and private sector experts to understand the landscape of resilience-related policies and their effectiveness. We analyzed recent federal resilience policy recommendations from other efforts and facilitated a cross-sectoral dialogue in a virtual workshop to collect feedback on our policy priorities. So through this research, several key issues with the federal approach to resilience emerged. First, the federal approach to climate resilience has been largely uncoordinated and decentralized, with resilience-related programs spread across federal agencies and no centralized tracking of how funds are actually used for resilience by local stakeholders. We heard through our research that there is a need for better coordination across federal stakeholders, and also a need to establish programs that focus exclusively on climate resilience instead of only folding resilience considerations into existing programs and regulations, though that is still valuable. The federal approach has also focused more on post-disaster recovery than pre-disaster hazard mitigation, and doesn't always encourage rebuilding in a more resilient way after a disaster strikes. So this approach, we think, misses a significant opportunity to optimize federal spending, given the high cost that the government pays in disaster relief, and that every $1 that federal agencies spend in pre-disaster resilience grants saves on average $6 in post-disaster recovery costs. Second, the federal government provides key information for climate risk analysis and planning through programs such as the National Climate Assessment, the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and the National Centers for Environmental Information. However, it can be difficult for local planners to find the climate information they need and determine how to use it. Information can also be out of date and not available for all communities or at a useful spatial scale, and not forward-looking to actually include climate projections. Meanwhile, regionally based climate-focused programs like NOAA's Regional Integrated Science and Assessments and USDA Climate Hubs can help local decision makers distill and tailor climate information from these national sources. But these programs are limited in the number of communities that they are able to serve with this technical assistance. Third, in terms of the funding that the federal government provides for local resilience, there are several federal programs that are focused on local resilience or hazard mitigation projects. For example, FEMA's new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, while other programs like the EPA Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds can be used for resilience-related projects, but are not focused on it. Across these programs, though, the level of funding available for resilience is insufficient to match the very large need on the ground. Funding gaps also exist for certain hazards and needs, including extreme heat and wildfire risks, grid resilience, and also managed retreat. And importantly, many communities face significant barriers to accessing federal funding. Funding needs are particularly acute for low-income and marginalized communities in both urban and rural areas who often face multiple challenges in accessing resources. These include lack of capacity to assess future climate risk, which Crystal spoke a little bit to, complex federal application processes, as well as restrictive local cost share requirements for federal grants. So due to these barriers, federal funds such as floodplain buyouts, wildfire fuels treatment, as well as post-disaster assistance often flow disproportionately to wealthier communities with more resources, which often exacerbates pre-existing inequities and vulnerabilities for marginalized communities. And lastly, in terms of financial risk, communities are facing significant climate-related financial risks, including threats to their overall economic stability, pricing signals that may steer investments away from vulnerable communities and regions. And at the individual level, homeowners and renters are often unaware of the physical climate risks that their property and subsequent financial risks that they may face by living there. Recent actions like the executive order on climate-related financial risk take a significant step forward in addressing these issues, but more action is needed by Congress to assist communities in mitigating their financial risks. So our federal action plan works to address these and other shortcomings and gaps and really transform the federal approach to resilience. So I'll quickly highlight a few of our recommendations. In terms of working effectively and strategically to administer government resources, we recommend tracking agencies' distribution of funds for climate planning and risk mitigation activities. Specifically, we think that the Office of Management and Budget should collect and report back information to agencies in the administration to aid federal coordination and decision-making and support agency alignment with strategic goals, such as supporting more equitable funding allocation, which I mentioned before. We also recommend that Congress and agencies devote more funding and effort to interagency partnerships, given that climate risk is deeply tied to existing issues around housing, economic development, public health, and many other interdisciplinary issues. Areas that we think could benefit from these partnerships include identifying and assessing local economic risks to climate hazards, planning for climate displacement, and increasing the resilience of new and existing affordable housing. In terms of providing leadership to address gaps and drive the direction of resilience action, we recommend that Congress continue to increase funding for key pre-disaster hazard mitigation programs, such as the Fema hazard mitigation grants, the Department of Energy Weatherization Assistance Program, as well as the EPA revolving loan funds. And these increases should include set-asides for low-income and marginalized communities. We also recommend that the government ensures that federal climate information programs offer really high quality data that fills important gaps. We think that Congress should significantly increase funding for climate data research, including developing higher resolution climate models and updating and expanding key existing sources of information. We also think that the government should better facilitate disclosure of climate risks to improve the information that is available to both local decision makers and individuals, whether it be homeowners or business owners or renters. Doing so would also accelerate resilience investments at the community and household levels. So this can be facilitated, for example, by Congress reforming the National Flood Insurance Program to require flood risk disclosure in real estate transactions and provide guidance to states on disclosing climate risks to renters. In terms of addressing inequities that put low-income and marginalized communities at higher risk, we recommend codifying a process to ensure that federal resilience programs and disaster response efforts do not contribute to deepening inequity for low-income and marginalized communities. Congress can do this by codifying the recent executive order on addressing environmental justice in low-income communities and communities of color to ensure that its consistent implementation and establish a special directive to consider federal climate resilience and disaster response activities. Also, we recommend removing barriers to federal funding for low-income and marginalized communities, including lack of technical capacity and restrictive cost share requirements. We think that Congress should institute more flexible cost share requirements for low resource communities, for example, at Fema. And in addition, we think that Congress and federal agencies should devote more funding and support through Fema programs and others for low-income communities to build capacity and develop resilience plans. And finally, in terms of acting as a strong partner to catalyze resilience action by local, tribal, and state governments and the private sector, we recommend that Congress increase funding for the regionally focused multidisciplinary centers and programs that I mentioned before to support more communities in assessing their climate risks, given that these federal programs act as really key resources for communities in developing localized climate information. And it looks like we're having some slide issues, so I'll just keep going. We also recommend amending key post-disaster recovery funding programs to better help communities build back more resiliently after disasters occur through, for example, permanently authorizing the Department of Housing and Urban Development's disaster recovery grants, and for the Federal Highway Administration and their emergency relief program, facilitating state and local governments' use of resilience features such as natural infrastructure when using these funds to rebuild highways after a disaster occurs. So in addition to these, we cover a number of issues and policy areas in the brief that this brief that we think are critical in accelerating local resilience. For more of our analysis and recommendations, please visit the report link, which we will share with you in the chat. So next we will turn to our panel presenters and hopefully get the slides working, who will share insights about the status of and needs for local resilience. Oh, sorry, one sec. Really, we're hoping to highlight the opportunity for the federal government to better support resilience in communities across the country. So first we'll have Lisa McNeely, who is the Director of Sustainability for the City of Baltimore. Lisa has worked in the environmental field for over 20 years and now leads sustainability and resilience efforts for Baltimore with a significant focus on equity and social justice. Lisa will be providing us with an overview of recent resilience actions that the city has taken. Next, we'll have Colin Wellingkamp, who is the Executive Director for the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Colin focuses on advocating and advancing public interests through improving local government functions and the activities of the business world. Colin will be sharing insights on green infrastructure projects in the cities and towns he works with on the Mississippi, and we'll get to see a resilience project in action, which is exciting. And lastly, we'll have Anna McGinn, who is Policy Manager for the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, or ESI. Anna focuses on several policy areas, including climate adaptation and resilience, federal, state, and local climate commitments, equity and environmental justice, and appropriations and budget. Anna works as part of the ESI team focused on federal policy issues and will be providing an overview of recent ESI research on resilience in coastal communities. So with that, I will turn it to Lisa.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to come to this panel and to talk a little bit more about the City of Baltimore. I'm in the Office of Sustainability in the city, which is in a somewhat unique position in that we are the ones who do the hazard mitigation planning for the city and oversee several areas of environmental permitting, including floodplain management. We call our hazard mitigation plan a disaster preparedness plan. Since 2013, it's also been our climate adaptation plan. So it not only looks at the required natural hazards and our vulnerability to those, but also we have worked to try to include some sense of how we expect climate change is going to make those actions worse and to be planning for that. It's this is one of several places where I may highlight that what the federal government is requiring does not right now address the increased risk for the different risks that we may be facing from climate change. Our city also has a nuisance flood plan. This is required by the state of Maryland. That's about getting more data around nuisance flooding. The idea for the state is that all coastal regions, well, there we go. Second slide, please. Yay. That with the nuisance flood plan, all coastal counties would be required to be gathering data around flooding, sort of the range of territory, so that the state could start to have a better sense of what else needed to be done. And this is one of those areas where we have found our state emergency management agency, MEMA, to be a really key partner for us as we are looking to sort of do our planning a little bit better. A reminder, now seeing the slides, we're going to be updating our DP3 to include human-made hazards, addressing equity, and looking at sort of some community resiliency planning, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. Next slide. I wanted to start here at the beginning and really talk about how we use an equity lens. I mentioned that we're going to do our DP3. Sorry, I'll keep using that acronym, but that's our hazard mitigation plan. Do our DP3 update with an equity lens. We're also doing our climate action plan with that. And just as we talked about, what C2ES's definition of resilience is, we have a definition of equity. On a related note, the city is actually currently looking to create our own definition of resilience. We We hear from some in our community that it's a phrase that they don't actually, it's a framing that they don't like. Feels like it's I don't want to speak for somebody else, for everybody, but what I've heard is that it really kind of pushes responsibility to the individual rather than that root cause. And so kind of back to this issue of being concerned about what is existing structural inequities, you know, what are sort of the distributional inequities around resources, and who sort of bears that burden. This is sort of kind of a very common sort of part of our conversation. Next slide. And then, you know, these are some of examples of the kinds of hazards that Baltimore is facing. You know, we consider our top hazards to be a range of flooding hazards, both the classic riverine, which you're seeing on the top right, but also to a certain extent coastal. But both of the two on the left are urban flooding that are when, you know, sort of sometimes it's when the sort of rainfall meets infrastructure and they don't get along very well. We see these kinds of rapid flash floods. But we also know that we have, you know, we are facing significant problems with other types of extreme weather, not just these extreme sort of downpours and sort of microbursts that sometimes cause our flooding, but also extreme cold, but extreme heat, as we've already talked about. We know that we're expecting that, you know, that we'll see double the number of heat days above 95 degrees, that rainfall may see, which has already increased 5%, may go up another 12 to 15%. But, you know, kind of back to the issue of equity, where one of the things that we're also really trying to pay more attention to is when we have, you know, multiple hazards happening at the same time, really kind of compounding their impacts. I don't have listed here an event in 2012 when we had high winds that caused power outages right before several days of an extreme heat wave. You know, we know that is when not just individual resilience, but community resilience can really be strained, is when these when we have multiple hazards at the same time. You know, and this is why with equity, you know, we know that local government can be where equity kind of can really we can identify those needs, and some of those solutions can be implemented and designed, you know, and hope that this is an area where the federal government, I was pleased to hear all of the discussions around environmental justice, but this is an area where we see the federal government can be a partner, and maybe not just for funding. Next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the floodplain management. Again, we just incorporated or adopted new maps from Fema. It's important to note that those maps do modeling based on historic data. It does not include any estimates around climate change. And so one of the things that Baltimore has done is to then increase our code standards as a way to kind of prepare ourselves for that. So we, our floodplain requirements and for development, for new development and substantial improvement is not just for the standard regulatory floodplain, the 1% annual chance, but we regulate more broadly to the 0.2 annual percent chance. And then we require an additional 2 feet of protection. So people have to elevate not just to the estimated flood level, but higher. But this is, you know, we also participate in a community rating system. Again, this is partly to ensure that we are doing as much as we can to sort of minimize that risk of flooding, but also because we're very aware of, you know, who it is that is required to purchase flood insurance. It tends to be people who are buying, you know, it's the people with the federally backed loans are required to have flood insurance if they're in the floodplain. And so by doing this work, we give our residents up to a 25% discount in these policies, which currently saves people over $800,000 a year. And this includes the city. this is, and so these are, a couple of the examples of sort of where we're working to do things. Next slide. But it is more than flooding. It is also heat. People have, the last couple of summers have really shown us how hot things can be. These are two maps from a series that was reported in summer of 2019, showing how different neighborhoods can have can sometimes have up to a 10-degree difference. In this particular map, it's only showing an 8%. We've seen other studies where it's higher. And you can see how these hotter areas align with the levels, areas of higher income, which are also, if you've heard this phrasing, that's often called the white L in Baltimore, with the black butterfly being those areas in East and West Baltimore. If I had a map up with redlining, you would see this very closely as well. We know that we want to pay more attention to heat because you have such a high life safety and quality of life issue rather than that building or property damage. And so, when we see sort of estimates of community preparedness, it's not as clear that it truly reflects some of these communities which are hotter and maybe less prepared. Next slide. And so just one other area where we're doing work is community resilience planning. So one aspect of that is doing some deeper dives in maps. This is an example where we looked at urban heat, but also asthma, child asthma rates, and single parent households, but also distance to some of the public cooling areas. You can tell this was done pre-COVID, but still you can see that even in areas of greater vulnerability, we know we have areas that are even higher that can hopefully help drive, again, back to that distributional equity question. But the thing I want to sort of talk about, not in necessarily a great deal more detail because I want to be cognizant of time. I think somebody probably gave me a 1-minute warning in the chat, but I can't see you when it's full screen. But next slide, our community resiliency hubs. I think a lot of different communities have these groups. For us, we have now around 12 community orgs who partner with us, but who are the groups that are going to be there on the front lines, who are going to respond in the event of disasters, citywide, but also even very localized. This is, a key part of our work. These groups really stepped up during COVID, and we've been thrilled to be partnering with a range of actors, including our Maryland Energy Administration, on trying to get solar and battery storage for some of them. This is one of those areas, and I don't want to leave it on a negative point, but this is one of those areas where it's not clear that supporting this kind of work, where the communities are at the front line. These are the people who kind of really know best in their hyper-local areas what can be done to increase resilience. And it's not clear that there are paths to get the kind of federal funding that is available and how best to access that to help in their work. So on that, I will I'll wait and I'll look forward to questions after the fact, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Colin and Anna.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Now we will turn to Colin Wellingkamp from the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colin Wellingkamp. I'm the Executive Director of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, coming to you live from St. Louis, Missouri, whose skyline is actually positioned right behind me here. Nice view on this October day over the Midwest. And just by way of orientation, I'll turn the camera a little bit, and there, right here, you see the beautiful St. Louis Arch. And then, of course, turning a little bit more, who is always our guest of honor, right here, the mighty Mississippi River. Our association is comprised of 101 mayors along the Mississippi River, from Bemidji, Minnesota, which is the first city on the river if you're traveling south, all the way to New Orleans, Louisiana, with 99 of their closest mayoral friends in between. We're headquartered here in St. Louis, Missouri. That's where I'm coming from. But we do have all 10 states represented in our corridor. Our corridor is no stranger to climate impacts. Since 2005, our river valley has sustained over $210 billion in actual losses. That's billion with a B in actual losses since 2005. That was the year of Katrina. Things just kept getting more persistent and worse since then, with floods, droughts, intense heat, and named storm events throughout the ensuing years, all the way up to today, which gives us that monumental price tag of actual losses. And moving from there, the most expensive of those losses is named storms like hurricanes, of course. But right behind them is not what you would think. It's actually drought. Droughts are some of our most longest lasting disasters. They ripple through the economy more than any other disaster, and they tend to have the longest lasting effects over time. The last major drought that we had was in 2012, and that was a 50-year drought, and that cost us $35 billion with a B in actual losses throughout the Mississippi River Basin. Just to give you some context to that number, the most devastating and longest flood in U.S. history along the Mississippi River corridor was actually a basin-wide event. Along our river, it was only $6.2 billion in actual losses, as compared to drought, a 50-year drought at that, of $35 billion. So what do we got here? What are we trying to do? What have our mayors done over the last few years since we first started, which was in 2012? After that drought, that's when our mayors first got together, started organizing, and really wanted to put together a climate action plan and a resilience platform with sustainability capacities, mitigation, adaptation curriculums built in for this corridor. Why? Well, this river valley that you see right behind me, it generates over $500 billion in annual revenue. It employs over 1.5 million people. By the way, this city right here, St. Louis, myself, everybody in it in the surrounding region are all drinking this water, drinking surface water right off the Mississippi River. It goes into 49 other cities up and down the Mississippi and into 20 million people every day. So your coffee, all the beverage industry, all that beer that Anheuser-Busch makes just downriver from me, right over there, that also uses Mississippi River water. So does Pepsi and Coca-Cola for all of their beverage needs that have plants along the river. So that is a major manufacturing agriculture economy. The second largest economy on the Mississippi River, right behind manufacturing, is outdoor recreation and tourism. And I'm actually standing in one of St. Louis's premier venues. As a matter of fact, one of their premier attractions, the Lumiere attraction, right on the Mississippi River. But this river draws people from all over the world. That's why we have a burgeoning renaissance of Mississippi River cruising from Viking, American Cruise Lines, and American Queen Steamboat Company. So what do our mayors do in order to keep this corridor whole, keep the ecology working, the environmental services uncompromised, and keep our cities safe from persistent mounting disasters? Well, one of the things we're doing is actually within your view right here. If you look out over here, this tree line right in front of me here, just over those trees is a natural infrastructure asset called Horseshoe Lake. Horseshoe Lake naturally absorbs floodwater that goes over the levee and collects from behind the Mississippi River trying to get to it. It's an old meander of the Mississippi River from ancient times. Right now it's a lake. The river actually used to go out over there beyond those trees and circle back long ago. It has since straightened itself over time, but that lake is still there. It has a marsh, it has wetlands, it acts as a huge catchment basin, hundreds of acres in size, that captures a lot of the flood water that devastates North St. Louis Jefferson County, and points in Illinois Metro East all around me here. This is East St. Louis, Illinois. Next to them is Sauget, Illinois, Madison, Illinois, all the way on down to Chester, Illinois. All of these areas get devastated by flooding regularly. Last time was 2019. Not so much water from the Mississippi River, but backwater behind the river trying to get to it. We're now working with Ducks Unlimited to increase the capacity of that Horseshoe Lake, increase it, and also divert floodwater away from coming through East St. Louis right over here, and instead would actually go over into Horseshoe Lake instead of businesses and homes and basements in Metro East St. Louis, Illinois. So that's just one example of a project we're doing. We're deploying natural infrastructure projects up and down the Mississippi River to do very similar things and act in similar fashion to mitigate all these disasters. And when I say disasters, I'm not just talking about flooding. I am also talking about named storm events, talking about drought, and I'm also talking about intense heat, which has been mentioned. Intense heat mitigation and adaptation is especially key and valuable to our cities up north, Minnesota, Wisconsin, where the ecology and the population aren't used to having to deal with such long periods of intense heat over and over again. Not to mention the infrastructure isn't there to deal with it either. The grid capacity or the infrastructure that has been built just doesn't typically absorb a lot of heat on the regular like we do in these lower middle reaches of the Mississippi and then point south. So in order to get there though, in order to figure out where do we deploy natural infrastructure for the best bang for the buck to mitigate the most damage and help the most people, not only that, but what kind of infrastructure do we deploy? Wetlands and marshes and forests, reconnected backwater, reconnected floodplain, those all work differently. And they don't necessarily address all of the same problems in the same ways. So how do we do that? How do we figure all that out? And then finally, once we have, how are we paying for it, right? Over what period of time, where, and how do we onboard and add new projects over time in the near and farther term? All of those questions we announced answers to last month during our annual meeting. Our mayors got together with mayors from all up and down the corridor and critical partners, both federal, state, and NGOs, to do two things. One, develop a natural infrastructure disaster capacity study. This study, conducted and spearheaded by 2 Degrees Adapt, partnered with Cargill, Black & Veatch Engineering, One Architecture, and other partners around the world, actually. Sorry, income call from one of my mayors, as a matter of fact, to tell us where exactly we are having the most damage and where are the areas with the most repetitive loss and what areas are most vulnerable to continued impacts from all of these disasters: named storms, flooding, drought, intense heat. Once we had that study, which we did determine outlined an entire area for us along the Mississippi River where to deploy natural infrastructure, we brought in another partner, Ducks Unlimited, a household name, one of the foremost conservation authority organizations in the world, and headquartered along our river in Memphis, Tennessee. Ducks Unlimited is now working with us, guided by 2 Degrees Adapt's Natural Infrastructure Disaster Capacity Study, to deploy infrastructure along the Mississippi River that will do all of these things. It'll also have other ancillary benefits of sequestering carbon. In fact, we believe that we can add to President Biden's non-power sector NDC commitment of upwards of 30%. After he meets his NDC inside the power sector, he still has over 1 million tons of carbon he's got to find somewhere to sequester in order to meet the NDC, which, by the way, isn't even 1.5 degree compliant. So how does he do that? Well, it's going to come from land use changes and other sectors of the economy like agriculture. Also, it's going to come from the deployment of more infrastructure, natural infrastructure, to eat up that carbon we think we can hit that delta by as much as 30% with these projects. Not to mention, we can also add to the 30 by 30 commitment of conserving 30% of mainland United States land by 2030. These lands will do that as well. We do have some solid federal recommendations, however, in order to assist what we're doing. One, fully fund the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund Act, or STORM Act. It's in the bipartisan infrastructure package, which our mayors worked hard on with Senator Cassidy to put in there. 500 million over 5 years. It's 100 million a year for that brand new tool for states and localities to use for projects like the one I just mentioned. Also, the White House can appoint an official, a chief White House resilience officer, to help organize, coordinate, and synergize this work across the federal family. And then nextly, I mentioned drought a lot, and we're actually seeing the effects of some abnormally dry areas right now. You'll see right here next to me, the river's pretty low. We are just outside drought here in the middle reaches of the Mississippi River Valley, but north of us, and in Iowa, Minnesota, and the headwaters region, they're in some cases, in extreme or exceptional drought. It's really bad up there, and that's where the ecology is actually most sensitive to it. Right now, drought is an ad hoc question within the emergency managed platform of the United States. Just recently, the governors devastated by drought out west, fighting these forest fires, these wildfires, requested an emergency declaration so they could spend FEMA money on drought. And that is an ongoing analysis. How do we do that? How can you spend federal emergency management money addressing drought? Those questions yet to be answered, but should be as soon as possible, considering the impacts. Look forward to working with organizations like CES2 going forward in this work and moving the federal platform forward and being a more advanced response to all the disasters and impacts that we're facing. By the way, we're sending 2 mayors to COP26 for the UN climate meeting. MRCTI is an official observer organization to the UNFCCC. Our mayors are excited to be there and make an impact for our region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Colin, for all the information, and especially for the live look at resilience on the Mississippi. So with that, I will turn it to Anna McGinn, and I will just share her slides from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. And Colin, that was really cool. Slides feel a little silly after the live demo, but excited to get started here nonetheless. So as Laura said, my name is Anna McGinn. I work for the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you all what EESI is doing, and thank you so much to C2ES for the invitation. I just want to check in, make sure you can see me.
Yes, we can.
Great.
Thanks.
EESI is based in DC. I want to pause and acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Anacostia and the Piscataway peoples. EESI provides information to members of Congress and their staff on climate, energy, and environment issues, and you can see a little bit more about our work on this slide. I'm really excited to be here today as C2ES launches its new report. It raises many very interesting areas in need of attention, coordination, funding, leadership, particular attention to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, low-income communities, and rural communities, all in an effort to scale up resilience and adaptation efforts across the US. So thanks so much to the C2ES team for compiling this really useful report. If you could jump to the next slide. About a year ago, EESI released a related report called A Resilient Future for Coastal Communities, building off a 16-part congressional briefing series that we hosted in the year preceding the report's launch. Today, I'm excited to share some of the synergies across our report and C2ES's report, and share some of the stories and experiences that EESI learned about from people doing work on the ground around the country on adaptation and resilience. I do want to acknowledge that I am not working on the ground doing adaptation and resilience work, but Still excited to elevate these stories from both our coastal resilience report and other adaptation and resilience focused work that EESI has been doing. And really encourage you to check out EESI's briefings to hear information that I'm going to share straight from the sources as well. So with that, we'll jump to the next slide and dive right in. So first, we're going to start with a story that's in the upper left-hand corner of the slide in Kansas. So actually an interior example to get started. So the image on your screen on the upper left-hand side is in Strong City, Kansas. The story here was shared with us by a floodplain manager during an EESI briefing. I'm retelling it here because it demonstrates the opportunity for federal actors to learn from and bolster local level resilience versus making it more challenging to build resilience at the local level. So Strong City is a town of about 580 people. They have a highway that runs into the town and it has a culvert under it. On the north side of the highway, there are houses. On the south side of the highway, there's a stream. And when it rains, of course, the water wants to flow to the stream and was flooding the highway. So for a long time now, when it rains, the volunteer fire department would come out and set up a pump and pump water across the road, which would close the highway. You can see that in the image provided. So this was sort of working, but obviously had to close the highway, which was not ideal whenever it rained. So Strong City asked for a federal mitigation grant to put in a small flood-proof pump house right near the culvert where they could pump water under the road and not have to close the highway. This would help to both protect the houses and keep roads open all the time. Unfortunately, when they applied for this federal mitigation grant, the grant was denied. And the backstory behind this is that when you apply for a mitigation grant, or at least the one that they were applying to, you had to prove that for every dollar you were going to spend, you were going to have $1 in losses avoided. But since Strong City had done such a great job of avoiding losses, they didn't have a history of homes being flooded because of the volunteer firefighters' work to get out there and pump the water every time there was a big rain event. The fact they had done this good job means that the grant was denied. So some takeaways from this story. Many small town leaders are very adept at crafting creative solutions within the confines of both small budgets and few or even no paid staff. But at the same time, there are these hosts of active federal programs that could assist. But the challenge is that a lot of these small rural communities face significant barriers to access these programs. And that could be because the program design at the federal level, as the one described in the story, could inadvertently punish rather than promote local actions that enhance resilience. It also can be the case that because of lack of staff to do mapping or other work, it's even more challenging to figure out which grants to even apply for and which ones are available and to access that federal support. So then jumping to the next story I want to share, the middle image you'll see on the slide is in Hawaii. So I want to talk a little bit about finance. In both C2ES's report and EESI's report, we talk about a significant need to scale up finance for resilience. One way to do this is with a national climate bank. The image here is of homes that are all tied together by a solar-powered microgrid. The homes were built to house previously homeless people, and the homes and the microgrid were built at the same time with the backing of the green bank in Hawaii called the Green Energy Money Savers, or the GEMS program. As the managing director at GEMS explained to us, what's really interesting about this project is that in January 2018, when the first families began to move in, the village was not yet hooked up to the overall utility grid, but the microgrid powered by the solar panels was functional. And because of the situation kind of out of control of that overall utility, they weren't actually able to connect the homes or the community to that overall utility grid until June, so 5 months later. But the microgrid was able to provide all the energy needs of the families and the community center and the childcare facility and the convenience store and human services offices without a problem. So the financing for this microgrid was able to allow this community to be resilient. And in the future, if there are issues with the overall utility grid, there's a proven track record that this microgrid will be there to continue to support the people and community resources in this village. So this project is a pretty exciting example of both adaptation and mitigation benefits that would not have been possible without investments from the state Green Bank. Along these lines, having a national climate bank that could scale up this sort of work would produce significant opportunities for communities around the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate impacts. The final story I want to share today is zooming over to Washington State and their network of local hubs supported by federal programs. So within that network includes the Climate Impacts Group, which was one of the first NOAA Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Programs, or RISA programs, the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center for the Northwest, and Sea Grant, just to name a few. And I know that Laura talked about the importance of these programs and her explanation of what's in their brief as well. You can see one example, the final picture on the slide, of a session being hosted with the community by some of these groups to discuss localized sea level projections and related projects, which is a really incredible initiative that I encourage everyone to check out. And I also wanted to share another example of the work that this network of local hubs supported by federal agencies is doing. And that is co-producing tribal resources for climate change vulnerability assessments. As one of the leaders of this work described to us, they worked with the affiliated tribes of the Northwest Indians and identified a number of different barriers to climate preparedness. And these range from social barriers, political barriers, and then also technical barriers. And those technical barriers are really where the Climate Adaptation Science Center and Climate Impacts Group said we're really able to step in and provide support here. So at the time when this project started, the only climate data that was being delivered specifically to the Northwest and Great Basin tribes was how annual average temperature and precipitation might change over tribal reservations. But like probably everyone on this webinar, you might want some more information than just that. So tribes were concerned about a variety of climate impacts, from impacts on plants and animals, wildfire, heat waves, water availability, and more. Also expressed a lot of interest in understanding and evaluating climate risks and making decisions across a lot of different geographic areas. So not just reservation land, but also the watershed in which they were living, counties, traditional territories, and ceded lands. So as described to us through the experts that joined us on our briefings, they worked with input from 84 tribes who chose to participate in tool development. And the group put together the group created and co-developed an online tool that provided climate summaries and climate information that was specifically tailored to all of the needs identified by the tribes that I just shared. And really interestingly and importantly, they established a tribal climate technical support desk, which is a hotline that tribal community members could call for help to put this data to use. I feel like this is a really critical piece of the puzzle, that providing sustained support for use of climate data and interpreting climate data, even after the funded project that developed that data has ended. I think that this example from the greater Washington State area is a great one that demonstrates the power of how these federally supported entities like the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, the RISA and Sea Grant and others can make a difference in building resilience of local communities in which they're embedded. If you could jump to the next slide. Great. So C2ES's report looks at, the role of the White House, the role of agencies, the role of Congress. I think that's really well complemented by what we did with our report, which was looking at these federal policy levers specifically for Congress. What Congress can actually do, what's within their power, and specifically as it relates to adaptation and resilience. And we came up with this list of 5 core areas. So amending existing agencies, offices, or program authorizations, appropriating funding, creating or commissioning a report, creating a new agency, office, or program, and establishing interagency or intra-agency coordination. I think these can be helpful to keep in mind as we think about Congress's role in building a more cohesive and coherent approach to adaptation at the national level. And with that, I'm really excited for the conversation. And thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of this.
Thanks, Anna, so much for sharing some of the lessons learned through EESI's research. We really appreciate it. I would now love to turn to the Q&A portion of the webinar. A reminder to our audience members to please submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. So I wanted to start off, this question will probably lead to us talking about a number of issues, but for all three of you, what are the top 1 or 2 actions that you think the federal government should take to better support local resilience?
I can jump in. I don't know.
Yeah, we can go in order. We can go in any order we want.
I'll jump in. I've got one that I think is pretty big, maybe more on the transformative side of things, and one that might be incremental short-term thing that can be done. So the big one is, I think we're overdue for a national adaptation strategy, and really hopeful that we are building towards that, especially with what we heard earlier from the keynote address, getting all agencies moving kind of in the same direction on funding and support is going to make a huge difference in support for state and locals. And then the more incremental piece is that one thing you all raised in the C2ES report is that funding is coming from so many different places, and it can be really challenging to know what any given project is eligible for, what different size communities should be looking at to get support from. So creating some sort of online hub, as you all recommend, I think would be a really useful step in creating or decreasing a barrier to access support, both funding support and technical support from the federal agencies.
Great. Let's go to Lisa.
Oh, sorry.
Or Colin. Either
Go
way.
ahead, Colin.
Thank you so much for the question. I would say definitely, as I mentioned in my talk, the fully funding the STORM Act, the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund, we have quite a broad coalition that's formed around that could use it in various sectors. For instance, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Society of Civil Engineers were our 2 most dedicated partners in passing the STORM Act. Next up would be a piece of legislation that our mayors wrote at the beginning and introduced to Congress the beginning of this year. It's called the SMART Act. It's the Andrew Young Safeguarding the Mississippi River Together Act. And although it is a regional bill, it does have the ability to be applied basin-wide. And it is a $2.5 billion bill that would basically onboard and build a federal platform supporting at corridor scale all of the resilience, climate, and adaptation projects and work that I described earlier. That's HR 4729, introduced by Benny Thompson of Mississippi and co-sponsored by Troy Carter of Louisiana. And then thirdly, I'd say you really need to start incentivizing at a systemic scale climate performance across activities, tax activities, grant activities, authorization activities, and at some point in there, allow that to lead to the codification of climate performance in U.S. law. Without codifying climate performance in U.S. law, no one can bring a cause of action for someone not doing that, for misusing land or not meeting their climate obligations. So those are some definite concrete steps that we can take in moving the degree adaptation down.
So this is, it's hard to follow all of those, plus all of the items identified in the brief. And so I took my extra time to sort of try to narrow my list down. Not a complaint about the federal government. I think we all are looking, I started out my career working in the federal government. I think we all hope looking to ways to make them a stronger partner. I think that, I talked a lot about equity. Again, I really feel like that's an area where, as a local government, we are sort of, we see those inequities, and, it's our role to kind of, turn around and to our state and our federal partners and help share what we've learned and what we know, to find ways to have conversations with our community members. You heard me hesitate a couple of times in my presentation. I'm always very aware of whose story this is to tell. I saw Anna do the same thing. This was somebody else's story. And we don't have good ways to tell those stories so that there can be that kind of learning, it's even me here today, although you wanted a government person here, and that works as well. But having that opening up, we know that there are people in FEMA who have been open to talking to us about that, and hopefully we can find ways to do that. I think I have to come back to issues around the non-federal match. This can be a burden, especially when we're dealing with really wanting to be out and doing kind of community-based work and supporting those community groups. That can be a burden. Would love to see if there was a way to open up that eligibility for just the 10% federal match requirement. And I have to put in a pitch for data, not just because I was a math major. I mentioned that we just updated our FEMA floodplain maps. The state and the consultants who worked with them did an excellent job, but I have to note that they modeled anticipated flooding for one of the main sources of riverine flooding in the city with 0 stream gauge data, because they either didn't have enough data points or they had been broken for decades, or they were so far away that they weren't calibrated for use in an urban area. And it leaves us somewhat blind on what we need to do. Is this map, does it overestimate flooding? Does it underestimate? Does it underestimate it by half? Do we need to be, we have other areas where we're looking at buyouts, where do we need to focus our scarce time and resources on this?
Yeah, thanks so much for highlighting each of your priorities. And Lisa, that's a great segue into my next question. I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of your experiences with, developing resilience plans and using climate risk information to better understand the risks. And this ties to an audience question that we also received about really engaging, low income and marginalized communities of color in this process. How is that done? So if you could speak more to, broadly your climate risk assessment processes, Anna and Colin, for the communities that you represent, Lisa and Colin for the communities that you represent, and Anna for the communities that you've engaged with, and also specifically to the needs and the how of involving marginalized communities in these processes.
Yeah, if you all don't mind, I'll just kind of keep going. It's the issue of the capacity of communities to engage is large, and it looms large for most local governments. I think we are all aware of that need, but also of how much time and funding it takes. And so we've been lucky, again, for our climate action plan update, where we're also going to update our hazard mitigation plan. So it's all of those that we were able to find funding pull together funding from the city, from a local foundation, and from our state Department of Natural Resources, who all valued the importance of that, so that we can have a year-long engagement process to take the time to plan that engagement. So it's not just throwing a lot of acronyms out, but have that time to closely work with the community, compensate them for their time. We have a standard that we don't take community members' time if we can help it, without being able to compensate them for that. And it's that's and it takes that commitment across the city. So we know we have the support of our mayor, of the rest of the planning department, and it takes all of those people working together, I think, to try to plan that well. I'll leave it at that.
I'll take it from Lisa and zoom out from the city level to the regional level. So the first thing that we needed to really do is get a handle on the economic profile of our service area. We really didn't have any way to scientifically evaluate how many jobs were along the Mississippi River, what economies were thriving, what economies made up for the lion's share of the revenue. What were people doing and where were they doing it, and what was most critical to the region's prosperity. We did that through partnering with a number of organizations to develop a Mississippi River economic profile. The lower was done in 2014, the upper was done in 2016, and we could put them together and we could have a contiguous service area that everyone agreed on for purposes of analysis. That then allowed us to have the platform, if you will, for other types of analyses with FEMA and with NOAA, determining the impacts, the economic impacts, the infrastructure impacts of these ongoing and persistent disasters that have been worsening. And then finally, we could take all that and onboard to a vulnerability study for the corridor to find out, now that we knew what people were doing, where they were doing it, and to what degree, we could then figure out, okay, who's most vulnerable? What are they most vulnerable to? And what have been the historic impacts to those areas in the near term? And then finally, that allowed us to come up with a plan, an action plan. And you'll see a lot of the elements of that action plan outlined in our mayor's SMART Act, the Safeguarding the Mississippi River Together Act. So we took a lot of those findings, a lot of that data, and we helped us guide the actions that are outlined in that piece of legislation. And then also our 2021 federal policy platform. You can go to mrcti.org and see the federal priorities for our mayors on what they want to fund, what they need to fund, how much, what programs, in what agencies, in order to really make climate mitigation work at corridor scale. I will say an important point here is scale. No longer are mayors considering these impacts and the solutions just within their city limits, just within their backyard. A lot of the solutions and a lot of the problems actually aren't in the city's jurisdiction. The city is absorbing impacts from other activities and economies outside of it. This is especially the case along the Mississippi River Valley. So our mayors determined that it would do nothing if they only looked at and examined solutions for just their town or city. It had to be at corridor scale. It had to take into account that massive agricultural landscape that they're feeling the impacts from, both positive and negative, into the solutions. So that part definitely key.
Can follow on with just a couple more ideas. So one example that I thought was quite powerful that we learned about through our report is something that National Park Service is working on in conjunction with a number of partners, which is building vulnerability assessments directly into their management tools and their management software for all of their different national park infrastructure assets. And so it creates the opportunity for someone who is just doing who is doing the very important work of the day-to-day management of the infrastructure in the park. When they click on something in their management system about a bridge, not only is it the information that they need to have about the bridge, but it's also the vulnerability assessment, and the information is right there at their fingertips. So I think the more and more we can build in adaptation and vulnerability information directly into the management tools that are used, the more we'll reduce the barriers, the challenges to integrate that into implementation. And then to your audience question on community involvement into planning and implementation, I think one of the most impressive examples is Louisiana's Strategic Adaptation for Future Environments initiative, also called LA Safe. And they've done pretty incredible work for community-centered adaptation planning. And one piece that I thought was particularly cool is that they have this Lead the Coast program, and Lead the Coast trains local leaders on coastal and climate adaptation, race and power, facilitation skills, organizing training skills, advocacy training skills. And so local community members participate in Lead the Coast, get trained up on all these different areas, and then the graduates of the Lead the Coast program are then paid to organize and facilitate community meetings to come up with adaptation plans in conjunction with the communities that they live in. And then those plans are used to then bring the community together, select programs. The community, they had this process where they were all allocated plastic coins and dropped them into the bins of the projects they most wanted to see fund. And then that informed which projects the funding went to initiate the first adaptation steps that were taken in those coastal Louisiana communities. So I think that is one phenomenal example. And there's an enormous amount of information out there about what LA Safe has done in the Lead the Coast program. So I think that's one great way that not only can the community be truly integrated, but also can be trained up and have sort of workforce skills built into that process.
Great, thank you so much. And definitely a theme we're hearing today, and that we heard extensively through our research, is the importance of partnerships between neighboring municipalities, between levels of government, between local government representatives and community members. Lisa, as you spoke to with some of your processes, I'm wondering if you all could quickly, in our last couple minutes, just speak to your thoughts on the federal government's power as a convener of stakeholders across disciplines and levels of government to address resilience, and how you think that those types of partnerships could further address resilience for Lisa and Colin in the communities that you work, or Anna, the communities that you engage with.
I mean, I think that as local governments have, I always look to the federal government for, we look to our state first, so to the extent that the federal government can convene and help us learn across different regions. So I wasn't familiar actually with what Anna was describing. And if you saw me looking away from the screen, it's only because I was pulling up that website. And I think that these kinds of opportunities to see other best practices, to have these in-depth conversations is something that, and maybe to convene sort of the other policymakers, whether it's the Hill or other places, to hear these stories would be my vote.
From our point of view, I think the critical role that the federal government can play as a convener is really our message, at least to Gina McCarthy's team, would be, please don't leave out Middle America. There's a lot of tendency to focus on the usual suspects, notwithstanding Lisa's great city, but other coastal cities that are easy targets, and a lot of talk around Florida and California. But Middle America is absolutely critical to the climate conversation. And it also is the best place to show the rest of the world that the interior spaces of the nation are fully vested in climate performance, just like the coasts. In Middle America, we get the trifecta of droughts, named storms, and major events. And we're now counting the days where wildfires in the headwaters region are going to become a real serious challenge if the drought up there persists. So it is really critical. Yeah, the federal government can be a convener, but don't leave any folk out, especially the middle of the country. And then also with a critical role with the federal government is, I think, to their credit, we are seeing the science agencies really step up. Folks like NOAA and USGS, these agencies are really stepping up to improve and build the science metrics and the massive amount of data that we really need in order to support climate work. We actually wouldn't have been able to do our vulnerability study a couple of years ago. The science wasn't there yet. The technology wasn't there yet. Just in the last few years has that been able to be onboarded. And actually USGS has the largest scientific portfolio of the entire federal family on the Mississippi River, out of all the agencies. So working closely with the science agencies, I think, is going to be key, fully funding them and really bolstering that capacity so that we can measure this work and we can put the work on the ground where it's needed most, where there's the most vulnerability, and where you have historic disadvantages in play. We're along the Mississippi River. That includes the Delta, which to this day still remains the poorest region of the United States. Mayors like Eric Simmons of Greenville, Sharon Weston Broom of Baton Rouge, they're on the front lines of not only having to lift their cities out of disaster and recovery, but they start at a place of 30% poverty rate, which is a significant disadvantage to start from. Really need to understand what that means on the ground to these folks, what it means for the future of their jobs, for the future of their schools and all the infrastructure they depend on for their daily lives. That really needs to be included in the story and in the solution.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much to you both, and for all of you for your presentations and thoughts as we work to elevate these issues and build the case for federal support for local resilience. I want to thank everyone who joined in watching today's webinar. For more information on climate resilience and our full policy brief, I encourage you to visit c2es.org. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll wrap there. Take care. Bye.